Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do a video on the concept of revelation. This came up in one of Rafe Kelly's tweets. He had a couple of tweets that have I've had so many versions of this video that I haven't done. I don't know if I've mentioned it before in other videos. The tweet list that was part of the last monologue video I did, which I'll put this out on next Monday, so it will be last week for this video. Put another way, despite the fact that I'm convinced the bones of the West derive from Christianity, I do not believe in the Christian myth, nor not in the way I believe in the theory of evolution. I'd like to have a conversation about how you believe in the theory of evolution, because this believing thing, I mean, we're getting some propositional belief in there. And the funny thing I find with a lot of people, I'm not saying Rafe is this way, but the way a lot of people are they get real skeptical about propositional beliefs. They get skeptical about propositional beliefs in a very propositional way. So I do not believe in the Christian myth in the way I believe in the theory of evolution. I think Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke have offer a potential means past this. And a little bit later or a little bit earlier, I don't remember when the tweet was or the order. Worse, I don't think it fully articulates what the Enlightenment was or how it interrelates with religion. My hesitation in seeing the answer is simply a return, seeing the answer as simply a return to Christendom. There is no simple return to Christendom. There's no simple return anywhere. There's maybe a reappropriation of the past, but that past will be different in the present. It can't help but be. So I'm anybody who understands my continued offering of Christianity as a response to the meaning crisis should understand that you're not going to have the Christianity of your father or your grandfather. You're going to have to do your own work. You may derive great blessings and borrow heavily from them, but this is a complicated thing to talk about. So my hesitation in seeing the answer as simply as a return to Christendom is so far that I do not see the claims of revelation can be made congruent with scientific materialism. Okay, now the claims of revelation. So Rafe might be specific, have some specific issues with that, which I don't know, and so I won't address them here. But we need to deal with this word revelation. And I just recently saw Unbelievable had another worship leader loses his faith. What's going on? When I listen to these conversations, and the Christian Sean McDowell is the son of Josh McDowell, who was, to a certain degree, a pioneer in a certain kind of Christian apologetics, I find these conversations quite modernistic, and a lot of the issues involved in them will map onto this question of revelation. Now I want to play a clip again that I have played a number of times. Now, in some ways, when I get a little bit later into this about what the kind of thing we're talking about when we're talking about revelation, actually illustrates my relationship with this part of this video. I've listened to this part of this video numerous times, and when I keep coming back to it, I see more. Now, has the video changed? No. Have the eyes through which I am encountering and engaging, and the mind through which I'm engaging the video changed? Yes. And this is where, and I'm showing my hand a little bit, this is where I think John Vervaeke's transjective ideas are helpful. Because the thing that happens, and someone might say, well, there's more and more Heidegger coming in. Okay, fair enough. Why is this video different to me than it was before? Well, I am different. Well, is the video different? No, it's still on YouTube. Play it back again and again and again and again and again and again. It'll play back the same way every single time. But I hear it differently. Why? Well, I'm different. Well, what has changed in me? Well, what am I? So let's dig into this a little bit more.
It's useful as an adjunct to that. So Roger mentioned that the transcendent is what we bump up against when we realize our ignorance. And so it's that which transcends our ignorance. And that in itself makes it an implacable fact.
That's a really clever move he makes there, because in an age of a lot of skepticism about the transcendent, Peterson, with a little verbal sleight of hand, has just made the transcendent a fact. And he said, well, the evidence of that fact is because we bump into things.
Unless you believe that you have no ignorance, in which case there's no point in furthering a discussion with you. So the transcendent is the fact insofar as it's that which transcends our ignorance. But you can also think about it technically. So, and I think we know enough about how the brain works now, so that, not that we know much, so that useful things can be said about that. You tend to represent the world in the simplest manner that you possibly can that works for what you're doing. And so you don't actually see the world. You see...
Now this is, if you go back to my other video, Personality 2017-12, we see meaning before we see objects. And now this is kind of a re-articulation of that. We don't actually see the world directly. We see low representation cartoons, as you were, of the world.
Sufficient what you're doing. Simplest manner that you possibly can that works for what you're doing. And so you don't actually see the world. You see sufficiently useful, low resolution representations of the world. And if they work, then that's fine. There's no need to adjust them, and they're relatively easy to remember and to manipulate. But now and then you have a misapprehension about someone, let's say, and you have a conversation.
And now someone, because people are, they might look simple on the outside, but if you've ever known a human being, they're enormously complex on the inside. And the more you get to know them, I made a comment, was it on my video? I don't remember. I made the comment the other day that, so my wife and I have been married for 32 years. We have both been married longer than we were single before. We regularly bump into things we don't know about each other, and we regularly surprise each other. And you would think after 32 years, there would be no more surprises. Far from it.
Conversation with them, and the conversation goes sideways. And what that means is that the thing that you thought you were conversing with is not the thing that you're conversing with. And that manifests itself in error. Right? So error is the place where the transcendent reveals itself. And what is actually revealing itself is the reality that...
Now, what's interesting there is that not only did he sort of sleight of hand make the transcendent a fact, he also noted that the transcendent is not like being high on cocaine. In fact, most drug trips are the opposite of, at least recreational drug trips, are the opposite of the transcendent, in that you are actually you're avoiding the kinds of friction you're looking for in life. You're avoiding all of this, which is exactly why you're doing the recreational drugs. The transcendent is this thing that's stopping you. You can go back to Jacob wrestling with God. There at the Jabbok River, God was the thing in front of him.
It's outside and underneath your perceptions. And so what you see in the world, in some sense, is a set of animated cartoons. And a lot of that is actually a consequence of you seeing nothing but your memory, because your brain is organized so that instead of going through all of the difficult...
Now think about that maybe in internet language. Back when our internet connections were slower, you, and even still your browsers, will cache images on your hard drive. Well, what does that mean? Web pages that you go to regularly, instead of pulling all of that, back when internet connections were slow, instead of pulling all of those large graphics through the pipeline, the slow pipeline of your internet, they would cache it on your hard drive. So that when you clicked on the site, boop, there would be the page. And the only thing that the browser would look at would be the differences. So in that sense, the differences were the transcendent elements, but all the other images were cached. Cached locally, because you could pull it up from your hard drive far faster than you could pull it through the internet connection. And what Peterson is noting is that in some senses, that's an image of the way our brains work. Our brains remember these things. And again, I used to have this, I've told this story before. I had this friend at church who had very low eyesight. He was periodically blind, and then his eyesight would return just a little bit. And I would sometimes just, not on purpose, just if he was someplace, I would quietly move next to him to be with him. But he was also hard of hearing, and he had low eyesight. So then it was, in your mind, his field of vision would look as mine did, but that's actually the cached version of the world on his mental hard drive. And then suddenly when I'd pop into the picture and he wasn't expecting it, it was like I Dream of Jeannie popping into the scene. And he would take a step back, and then he'd excoriate me for startling him again. And I got to make more noise when I shuffle up to him so he can have some time for his brain to adjust and upload all of those things into his memory. But the thing is, we don't realize we're working like that. Just like in those old days, the images would just show up right away on your browser. Now, if you were savvy and you notice that, wait a minute, this is a story from a few days ago, I have to hit refresh and pull new images up because I'm sort of being fooled by the image before me.
Of having to look at the thing in itself, you look at what you assume to be there. And if you can get away with that, so much the better. But the thing in itself is always much richer than your apprehension of it, which is partly why you make mistakes, but also partly why you can continue to garner wisdom in the world. There's always more there than meets the eye.
Okay, so I've watched this video a number of times. Every time that I'd seen it, okay, I had a certain amount of things that I could apprehend. It would, the things that were relevant to the moment I would apprehend at a certain resolution. With increasing viewings of the video, increasing listening to his stream, this now is triggering more things, and each time I watch it, I see it at a higher and higher resolution, and I'm actually able to take in more and more of what he's saying, not just because of repeated viewings of the video, but all of the reading and conversation and things that I have done in between. So am I watching the same video again? The video is the same, but my experience of the video, that sort of the transjective relationship between me and the video, continues to change.
And God only knows how much more there's there than meets the eye. And you can...
And again, this is part of, if you hear Peterson's argument about the resurrection, he positions himself in a humble place and says, don't imagine that what you see is all there is. That, in fact, is the position of pride. Imagine that there's more than meets the eye. But that is going to have to be changed by, you have to work with what's in front of you. And both of those things are true.
Show this, even in the religious sense to some degree, because you could say that there's an element to the transcendent that instills people with a sense of religious significance. You can do that by immediately, scientifically, by feeding people chemicals, for example, that disrupt the inhibition of perception by memory. And then that puts them in a place where the transcendent tends to reveal itself, sometimes in overwhelming force. So it's not some fiction that this exists. What's transcendent is more real than the reality that you perceive.
Well, let's pick up on that, because the ancients and the medievals had a clear sense that it wasn't the world that was changing, it was we ourselves as we make an ascent towards deeper truths.
And again, this difference, what he's sort of talking about is the spirit of the modern is to say, how can I shape the world to fit my picture of it, or my preferred picture of it? And the ancients said, how can I change my perception to fit the world? And if you understand what Peterson just said, the difference between those two postures is really quite vital. And it ironically makes the modern look tremendously hubristic and really full of folly.
Higher forms of the beautiful as we ourselves become more self-conscious. So it's not the world that's changing, but us. I wonder if you could say how you understand the nature of that ascent, that movement, and what brings it about.
Well, I would be a bit wary of the metaphor of ascent. I think in Plato, it's quite clear what he meant, that he wanted us to actually to transcend our earthly perceptions and our earthly way of seeing things and look on the world from a God's eye perspective. And this could be done if we enter the world of the pure forms and so on, leave empirical reality behind. I think actually, insofar as the experience of the transcendent, as I understand it, is available to us modern people, it's not that way that we get it. Perhaps Jordan might be right that there are these drug-induced experiences where things open up to us because old barriers are suddenly swept away. But in my own case, it is the concentration on the empirical reality which at a certain point flips from mere sensory understanding to a vision in that of its communicating something to me. And I think this is what literature and art and music do at their best. They redescribe reality so that it is actually communicating something to you. It's not just there as an inert object before you. And that...
Now, he's speaking about something that people might talk about and use this word revelation.
Sense of the transcendence is like discovering yourself in a mirror, seeing in the world as a whole that thing in you that you could never identify in words, the subject which is looking at it. And it's not a mystery, but it's something that you can't then explain. And it's the difference between a good writer and a bad writer, of course, is that a good writer will describe something in such a way that the thing described has the soul of the reader in it.
And again, there's an element of the transjective there. You're finding yourself outside of yourself, and what do I do with that?
So that might be a distinction in part between the thing and the meaningful thing, right? And that's a very mysterious phenomenon. In fact, in some sense, the essence of phenomenon, because that means to shine forth. As we're surrounded by empirical facts, they're everywhere. There's more of them than we can possibly count, but some of them do emerge and manifest themselves as that conjunction between the factual and the meaningful, and then that's what's gripping. And if you're fortunate,
and we get this relevance realization.
To me, that's also partly what leads us onward, maybe in something approximating the ascent that you described, is that the set of facts manifests itself as implicitly meaningful. And that means, in some sense, that there is a call to you that isn't from within you. I don't know how else to put it exactly.
And now we're getting into this sense of revelation that something is being revealed to me. But now exactly what that something is, you don't know, and you can't know, and you may not know now. And that's why we're using the word call. Call is something that happens at the other end of the path. Come this way, follow me. And journey, metaphors of journey very much come into the mix.
Because you walk into a bookstore and a book will reveal itself to you, or you have a conversation and part of the conversation will trigger something in you. Or you're reading a scientific paper and much of it's dull, and then all of a sudden there's something that sparks outward that's like that's a portal into the transcendent. And that is a place where the fact and the meaning converge. And that's a phenomenon we don't understand very well. It has something to do with its convergence with the narrative that drives us.
Okay, so remember in my last video I talked a lot about narrative. So there's this narrative that's driving us, and here's this element here, and you can use Vervaeke's term, the relevance realization. Something clicks, something calls, and where is that thing? Is that the cell phone stand calls to me? Well, it doesn't call. It's just, well, what about this? And where is that calling? Is it in me? Well, yes. Is it in the stand? Well, yes. And obviously, it takes the conjunction of both of these to have that happen. And now we're getting into the idea of the phenomenology of revelation.
Whatever that happens to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Actually, it connects with the general problem of what the humanities are in the university. I've always assumed that in some way or another, if you're teaching literature or musicology or history of art or anything, you are opening young people to those moments when the world ceases to be a mere accumulation of facts and, as it were, addresses you. That requires literary criticism. It requires opening yourself to experience in a way that it requires a serious education of a special kind. And I think that if we thought of the humanities as directed towards that, we can see why they might be one way to fill the moral void.
Now it's interesting that he turns here to moral, because this calling, you notice, this is leaning towards action. This is and meaning. This is leaning towards action. So this is to fill the moral void. Well, what is the moral void? What is the moral about? The moral is about what you should do and what you should not do. It's about choice. It's about action. It's about going forward in the world.
That grows so easily in people's lives.
So Jung had this idea, which I really love. It's a very sophisticated idea. It's his idea of how the self, first of all. So the self, for Jung, Christ was a symbol of the self. So the logos was a symbol of the self. So that's sort of, what would you say? It's the divine essence of humanity. And the image of that is a symbol of the self. And for Jung, the self was the totality of the individual across time and space. So it's whatever you are as a transcendent object. That's a good way of thinking about it. And then
as a transcendent object, as an object which is real enough to be obstacle.
you can imagine that transcendent object also has to interact with you and the world moment by moment. And his belief was that those times when that space of meaning opened up, so there was that convergence between the fact and the gripping of the fact, was the manifestation of the self, which is this transcendent object, in the specific moment of time and space, and therefore a call forward to move towards revealing that totality as much as it can be revealed. And so it would be partly, and that would be partly revealed by then following a meaningful pathway. And it would be the case that if you're engaged in the teaching of humanities and literature, that you are trying to engage exactly that part of the person. It's to pull them into the story and have that open up to them, and then that's a portal.
Now notice where that person is. Are they sitting in a room? Are they sitting in time and space? Or is their person somehow, where is that person? Is it there between their skin, or is it now journeying between time and space in a way that all of us have the sense of from time to time? We're watching a movie, and then at the end of the movie, the lights come back on in the theater, and oh, here we are. Where was I when I was watching the movie? Well, your body was certainly sitting there in the theater, but this I, where was I?
It's not words on paper. It's a portal to their further development towards the manifestation of this higher and more transcendent mode of being.
That's like the Hindu idea.
Okay. Again, you can watch the whole video. Very interesting conversation about competence later on in the video. So our narratives are cartoonish and dreamlike in a way. Now they sift, as this is what I talked about in my last video, why it feels like the world is coming unglued, and what I think I can and what I think can help. These narratives that we simply must have in order to manage the world, they're like the cached versions of images or videos on the internet. They're like these cartoonish things in our head, and we simply must have that because that helps us tremendously interact with this world. They sift and filter and shape the data for us. This is both how we maintain the narrative thread that personhood requires. In fact, I made the point to my wife that, after 32 years, she continues to be a transcendent being in my life. Not always happily, and I certainly am not always happily a transcendent being in her life, because we bump into each other. And after 32 years, we would think we would have enough of each other cached on our local hard drives in our head that everything would just be smooth. But no, there we are. Well, I mentioned to her, I said, it's probably a pretty good thing that, why do I have this experience with someone that I know with so much resolution after 32 years of marriage, but I don't have it with people I meet on the street? Well, because, all these psychological things, transference, projection, all of these things that are going on, these are not only difficulties in seeing each other, but they are probably relational lubricant, so that I project onto someone that I'm talking to a whole bunch of goodwill that they might in fact not merit until something transcendent happens, and then I have to readjust. But we're doing this all the time so that we can actually function in the world. And this is in fact why these global communal narratives in the culture that we have and are simply essential, so that there are predictable pro forma non-player characterness scripts that we play out between each other, so we don't have to spend all of our time bumping into too much transcendence with each other. So there's good things and bad things about these cartoons that we're walking around with, especially the shared ones that we're working from. And it's also why we stick to our tribes and our narratives, because in our tribes we don't have to do all of that work bumping into other transcendent beings from other tribes, and so all of this fudginess between us. So at some point I'm going to have to distinguish between fudgy and sloshy, which is my new favorite word about words. And it's why we don't like being poked in the axioms. It's like why we don't like hitting no. It's like why we don't like encountering that person that we can't understand and can't mind read. And it's why we get frustrated, and so often why violence breaks out, because we get frustrated and then we want to instill our version on the world onto the other, and so the words aren't using, so now we resort to violence. Now, let's talk a little bit about Christianity. Now, skeptics often get their lampoonish cartoons of Christians from Christians. The population is large enough that maybe with some fairness or unfairness in a straw mannish sort of way, you get these ideas about what Christians are, and we see this fairly regularly. But modernity's categories hold for both groups often, okay? Modernity has this common sense epistemology that is increasingly getting unseated. Science and technology increases to decrease some of the low resolution cartoons that we have collectively embraced that we might call modernity. And this common sense epistemology is that we see objects and we know things directly, and we walk around with natural information and experience and supernatural information and experiences of a different class of things. All right? And that's sort of, you take modernity and you take this medieval category of supernatural and natural that Aquinas used for specific things, but sort of, again, as happened with these languages, these words they're sloshy. They slosh around amongst us, and we pick up different elements of the word, and before you know it, the word means a different thing than it used to mean. An analogy of this might be the common sense Newtonian physics, that even though when you were taking physics in high school and college, there are all these sort of unreal assumptions that you would have made. Well, let's pretend that there's no friction here, so we can figure out, and there's no wind resistance. And so in this ideal monarchical vision state, these will be the interactions between the billiard balls. And that world obviously has been breaking down for a while now. The world of all this common sense epistemology and common sense Newtonian physics. Even though it's tremendously handy, and when you learn physics in high school or college, you learn that common sense kind because it works well enough. It's a good enough cartoon for what you're working with. Now, for many skeptics, once you get to the supernatural, things get problematic quickly because it seems to violate their common sense epistemology, their very Newtonian world. If your religious cartoons if your religious cartoon, that let's say you're a celebrity apologist talking to a celebrity atheist, and you're reliant on supernatural, well, the battlefield sort of lays itself out, and your whole conversation is going to be yes or no on the supernatural. And you can go to YouTube and find dozens and dozens and dozens of videos about natural versus supernatural. Why? It's a function of modernity. It's how it lays out. There are lots of debates about evidence for miracles and the resurrection, so on and so forth. Now, miracles were considered proofs of Christian validity until modernity, and then they all became suspect. Thank you, David Hume and a number of others. And this says, well, these things seem highly improbable, therefore they didn't happen. C.S. Lewis comes along in Miracles and says, all of history is a one-off. So all of history is a sample of one. And what C.S. Lewis pointed out in that observation is your estimation of the probability of this depends on where you're standing and the scope of your sample. Saying cars have accidents assumes a world of cars, of multiple cars. Your sample assumes an entire world in which the car is seen, and the essence of car and the identity of car are all elements of the picture. And so you isolate this and say, aha, and well, what about the rest of the picture? What about this and what about this? Same goes with laws of physics. What are the laws of physics? They are repeated observations that have shown a degree, and this is where statistics comes in, a degree of variability. And of course, Rupert Sheldrake wades in and says, well, then why do you have an Academy of Standards? If big G gravity is a constant, why do you have to track it? You don't track the number 1. Why do you track the speed of light? Why is it changing? Well, modernity can't handle that. Its low-resolution physics and its assumed monarchical vision world says, here's the constant. Then why are you tracking it? That's a really good question. So Sam Harris wades in and says, this book written by God. And of course, many theologians would say, it's not exactly what we're saying. When we say Word of God, that's a fairly powerful, low-resolution, downloaded image on the hard drive that we use so we can manipulate the conversation with other people about the values within the ecology of Christian values. That's how the Word functions. But many people hear it, and there's good many people. Well, these are the words of God, God says. And again, Christians will say, yeah, this is the language we use. These are the low-resolution images on our hard drive, and this language is enormously valuable and enormously useful for our conversations. But very quickly, you would say, well, wait a minute. If God would write a book, what would that book look like? Now, immediately, you're not examining what your assumptions about what you mean by this word God. And usually it sort of goes like this. Wouldn't a perfect being write a bestseller? Well, the Bible is the world's best-selling book. Not just by a little bit, but by a long way. But we'll leave that alone for now, because that's not really, that argument really isn't going to get much traction. Let's look at the second one. Wouldn't a perfect being write an irresistible book that just dazzles our eyes and we all fall down and worship? I think that's what he's really saying. And, well, pull that Bible off the shelf and, you can fall asleep reading this thing. And everybody gets excited going through Genesis and Exodus up to about chapter 20. And once you hit the table settings of the tabernacle, and then you get to Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy and, well, yeah. A perfect being would write something like this? Well, how many other books on my shelf don't seem superior to the Bible in terms of readability, even though, of course, far more Bibles sold than really a wonderful book, The Warmth of Other Suns. So let's examine your expectations. Let's examine what you think, why you think the world would be like this. We could use that AA term. expectations are preconceived resentments. So it's sort of like God writing in the stars, I exist, God, a great Frederick Buechner illustration, or spelling his name in our DNA. And Frederick Buechner says, one day if people looked up and, let's use English because it's commonly known in the world, the stars start moving around and they say, I exist, God. That first month everybody goes to church. Oh! Years later, well, that's just an incredible coincidence. How unlikely the sky would say such a thing. Would we all suddenly bow down? Well, maybe all of a sudden. But would we keep doing it? So, I'll even make your argument stronger. I'll steel man your argument, Sam. How about a God-man? What would a God-man be like? Would he be like Hercules and have super strength? Would he shine with brilliance? Would everything he say just whoosh? You know what? Well, why have I thought about this? Because I preach about this stuff and I think about this stuff a lot. If a God-man showed up, wouldn't everyone just love him and worship and obey him? What about that transcendent argument? The transcendent is the thing that we bump into that shows us the truth. And we're walking around with these low-resolution cartoon cached downloads in our mind. It's much more likely that the more transcendent someone is, the more of an obstacle they are to all sorts of things. And that same would obviously hold for a book. Tim Keller makes this argument about the Bible being crunchy, that the Bible is amazing because it speaks to so many cultures and seems to offend everyone at one point or another. That we read it and say, no, this. And Peterson makes the point, well, that's actually not a sign of what it's lacking. It's potentially a sign of something transcendent. So we would expect Jesus to, everyone would just hit the ground and worship him forever, like a vision from Dante of the beatific vision. That's what we imagine, and that vision holds a place in the imaginary, in the representation of what Dante is trying to make a point to. But when Jesus comes into the world, well, it's complicated the way he's welcomed and received. And so what we tend to do is shoot the resolution way down, and Jesus is nice in our projected low resolution, but not good enough to become God. Well, again, what are our expectations? Because here's the strange thing about people. We have these ideas of the good, but it's funny that they sort of defy our wielding. We all look around and can say, you're not as good as you think you are, and your ideas are substandard, and you're not acting the way you're supposed to act. Okay, well, why don't you be the perfect person? And if you were the perfect person, how would the world receive you? Wouldn't they keep bumping into you? Go back to Chesterton's point from his book Heretics, that we sort of do this dead reckoning in opposite of the bad. And so we have a tremendously difficult time imagining the good. And you find this in literature often because people struggle to represent the good. But we're really good at doing the bad because we know it and we revolt. And so the good is always sort of this opposite of the bad, and we're dead reckoning, and it's not very high resolution, and it's sort of out there. So I have a great deal of compassion for my skeptical friends, and our sensibilities. By our sensibilities, shouldn't a world made by a purportedly benevolent, all-powerful God perform better than the one we're presently occupying? Shouldn't there be less suffering, more happiness, no death or loss? But then if you look at The Good Place or Upload or how many other attempts by us to imagine the world we say we should be living in if the world were created by a completely all-powerful, benevolent God, we kind of aren't very good at sketching that thing out. Celebrity atheists, philosophers, and Hollywood writers are skeptical that this world could happen too. So if you sit down with Richard Dawkins and talk about that picture, he says, "No, I wouldn't want it." Okay. So in other words, the world you want is you're a little younger, a little better looking, a little more powerful, a little smarter, a little richer, or maybe a lot of those few categories, and you get everything you want. And so basically you would have a world without the transcendent. Well, read C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce. There's a world there where you get anything you want. What's the one thing that nobody can tolerate from each other? Is each other. And so in the world in which the Great Divorce opens, it's this massive city full of these big, impressive houses, and it's hard to find the people. The houses just keep going out and out and out and out because there's an element of transcendence in the people. But the people are degrading quickly in that world, and Lewis notes that grumblers eventually grumble so much, all that's left of them is the grumble. Ideas have people, and these bad ideas hold sway long enough that soon they consume the people, and there's nothing left of the people at all. The non-player characters eventually are incidental, and all that's left is the idea. So performance for the holders of revelation, we would imagine, would be superior to those who don't possess the revelation. Shouldn't revelation work something like a technology? If Jesus had offered people the germ theory or lessons on modern sanitation or medicine, wouldn't that have done more to healing the people rather than going to a village and here comes a blind man, bang, you're healed, and just kind of doing little one-offs? Certainly a systemic approach, if Jesus' goal was to heal a lot more people, a systemic approach would have been better and they would have been less suffering. So why wouldn't Jesus do that? Seems awfully dim of him. If God knows all the answers, why not just offer some helpful ones to us? Well, it all depends on what our problem is. We imagine that divine revelation would have the phenomenology of heroin or cocaine, that suddenly all of my problems would go away. But for a moment, if you recognize that, you realize, well, when you do heroin or cocaine, all your problems go away, not because you see the world more clearly, not because there's higher resolution of the world, not because you're actually seeing more of the real world out there. You're just seeing less of it. That's why you drink. Why you drink the problems away, but you don't really drink them away, because when your drink is gone, the problems are still there and you just have a hangover. Afford its wielding recipients the power of technology. That's what divine revelation should do. Like infections flee before antibiotics for a while. Like trauma flees before EMDR. And I have a member of my church who is a marriage and family therapist, and she sort of specialized in this, and she tells me stories. She says, it's amazing what this thing will do with patients. I'd have to talk to them for hours and hours and hours, and just, working through that crazy little bar, their trauma goes away. They get unstuck. And that's a wonderful thing. But now, are they now super people? Do we now watch them walking down the street and their marriages, they stay married forever and they sleep with everyone they want. When you start spinning out this perfect world, well, you keep bumping into these transcendent elements that we keep stumbling against. What did they call Jesus? A scandalon, a stumbling stone, a rock that makes men stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. We'd think that divine revelation would be indistinguishable from magic. But maybe instead of doing all this dead reckoning in one direction, I think in John Vervaeke's episode 13, well, there was kind of a revelatory moment there in that video.
Reciprocal narrowing. So here's your agent, and here's the arena. And what happens is the drug use is associated with a particular agent-arena relationship. And what happens is, and we talked about this before, remember, this is always co-identification. We're always assuming an identity and assigning identity in a co-defining, interdependent manner. What happens is you start to lose a little bit of your cognitive flexibility, perhaps due to something like this. As you lose your cognitive flexibility, the number of options in the world starts to decline, right? As the number of options start to decline, you lose the variability for your agency. As you get a tighter, narrower, less flexible cognitive agency, the number of options in the world goes down. And what happens is these two things reciprocally narrow to where you have no options as to who you could be or how the world can be. And that's addiction. It is a learned, not propositionally learned, perspectively, participatory learning of a loss of agency. I pointed out to Mark that if this is the case, there must be an opposite. If there's a spiral down, there must be a spiral up. And in personal communication, just recently, he said, yes, totally. And you know what that spiraling up would be. What would be the agent-arena relationship in which the agency and the world are expanding? That's anagoge. That's the move towards enlightenment.
Wouldn't revelation be involved in that?
What I want you to understand is dukkha is these two things because they're interpenetrating. This loss of agency, because this is your agency. As you're simultaneously doing parasitic processing within, you're doing reciprocal narrowing without. Those are totally reinforcing each other. That's dukkha. And no matter where you turn, this is always threatening. You can't get free of it. You can't run away from it. You can't deny it. Remember, the Buddha tried self-denial. This is like trying to hop over your shadow. You can't do it because it is endemic. All of this is endemic. This is the agent-arena relationship. You can't do away with this. This is indispensable to you being a person. This is self-organizing, relevance realizing, complexifying, processing. You can't get away from that because that is what makes you adaptive. So what do? That's what the Buddha meant when you realize that all of your life is threatened by dukkha. He didn't mean believe that all of life is suffering. So, what we need is, how do we address this? Well, once you realize it as a provocation, the point is, you should feel threatened. You should feel threatened, because if I can make you feel threatened by what I've just done here, how close and intimate this threat is to you, then you're starting to enact the process of moving towards enlightenment, rather than just asserting some propositions that are largely inert.
So right away here we see the relationship between revelation and agency. That addiction, agency, dukkha, Buddhist suffering, the wheel destroying itself, and a little later on in the video he talks about that. It's like a wheel with a center, but the axle's a little wobbly, or it's not exactly at the middle, and the more the wheel goes, the more it's the age of decay, it's things breaking down, and that is the nature of this world. And so you have reciprocal narrowing, and if you can have reciprocal narrowing, you can have reciprocal broadening. And revelation is something that expands your agency. But now again, be careful, because we just talked about our ideas of what the agency would afford us. We think it'd be like heroin or cocaine, that suddenly, we'd be in nirvana. Or we think it'd be like technology, like antibiotics or EMDR. It'd be indistinguishable from magic. But what is Jesus doing with his little 3 years that he's going to spend dealing with these disciples? What kinds of thing is he doing? He's doing these miracles, but his goal isn't exactly, well, let's have a few more healthier people than non-healthier people. Those would be the kind of goals we would have, but Jesus is up to something else. Now modernist revelation, again, we what I find is that the modern imaginary is dominating our ideas of revelation. And modernist revelation has the same difficulty we've seen with human beings wielding technology. So we enjoy the power, and sometimes we do some good things with it, but there always seem to be these unintended consequences. We are insufficiently wise with the power we have through it. And we say, well, science doesn't give you anything. People in the manifest image take things that they have learned about propositionally through science and wield them. Science doesn't say, science doesn't do, science simply is. There is no ought in the frame of science. We become like the drug addict with his drug, only we do so often communally. Just a little more power, just a little bit more knowledge, just a little more this, that will fix it. And we keep chasing that first high. Well, think about Jordan Peterson and his illustration of the hydrogen bomb. Well, should we make a hydrogen bomb? Well, we can. Well, is it true? Now, again, you've got Jordan Peterson and his funny ideas of Darwinian truth there, but that begins to scratch at this and expose a little bit of this modernist assumptions about revelation. Now, again, the last video I did, I talked about sense-making on Rebel Wisdom. I'm trying to get my mind around what they're talking about. Sense-making is attempting to get our cartoon narratives recalibrated with the incoming data. And in that video, I talked about the fact that we have these narratives, and in this video, I've talked about we have these cached images in our mind. And we've got this skinny information thing that's coming, and even that skinny information thing is too broad for us to manage, and so our narratives sort of swap things down until at some point the narratives get overwhelmed and we have to change our narrative. That's a tremendously painful, complicated thing. You know, so the sense making first makes us more wise. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, you wouldn't have a narrative if it didn't work for you in some way. But it's probably working for you in a tiny little narrow space of the world because you haven't hit up and come that much transcendence. And so I watched this very interesting video about psychedelics where this guy was talking about how and I'm not proposing psychedelics here. I've never taken any one, and I'm not judging those who have, but I'm not recommending them to those who haven't. But he talked about the fact that at the end of this journey, he realized that he had this little narrative that he had developed as a child, and it was time to let that narrative go. That narrative was a very helpful thing when he was 6 years old, but by the time he's 36, a narrative has to go. And that's the way life goes with us. And so our narratives keep getting updated, and so we keep working on that. Okay, so we want them to first make us more wise, and that's attunement, another Vervaeke word. The wisdom makes us more powerful, but hopefully in a life-giving way, in a generous way, rather than these really dumb technological leaps. Lack of wisdom. Oh, more knowledge. Let's grab it. We can make a bigger bomb. Let's go for it. Not be such a good idea. Andy Crouch was an editor of Christianity Today, a really wise thinker. You can find a lot of good stuff from Andy Crouch. He wrote a book on power a number of years ago called Playing God, and at this point already, before it got as large as it is right now, all of this rather low resolution dismissing of power. But the funny thing about all these low-resolution dismissings of power is they don't stop those who wield it from continuing to use it in all the ways they decry. So it's people with power, and that just winds up being a sneaky way to, well, give me the power and I'll make the world right. Oh, really? I'm not so sure. And, a classic lack of wisdom and trust. When Boromir wants to make a play for the ring, well, Gandalf and Aragorn, who are wise, know we'd better not hold it because we are suspicious, and the power that we have, the considerable power that Aragorn and Gandalf hold with the ring, Galadriel has the same question when Frodo offers her the ring. So why is it Frodo that carries the ring? Because he's a hobbit. Because he's small. And the ring is safer with him. And so you see a critique of power, but Andy Crouch makes the point that not all power is the same. God's power, because God is power and wisdom, God's power is generative, reciprocal broadening, rather than reciprocal narrowing. And God's power affords power for others. And it's generous, and it's generosity itself, Crouch says. So, yeah, we ought to be a little careful with power, but you're not getting rid of power as a concept. What you really need is wisdom. So we see the world through our cartoon narratives, and they're sort of like cartoons. And plausibility, again, is going to be a function of the data and the cartoons that are there. And plausibility has everything to do with the patterns of those cartoons. Well, here's another pattern that we're seeing, and well, it sort of seems to match and map onto this pattern, so maybe I can sort of make sense of it. And that's why we have this complicated relationship between data and narrative. We have Scott Adams' two movies that some people look at Donald Trump and say, he's a genius. Other people look at Donald Trump and say, he's an idiot. They're looking at the same data. Well, they're interpreting it through two different narratives. Scott Adams has a point with that. I mean, people believe what they want to believe. There's another way that we say it. And it all depends on, well, here comes the data. I have to fit this data into my narrative because human beings aren't just these creatures walking around. We're these narrative creatures. Our money is narrative. Yuval Harari goes into that. We're narrative creatures. It's simply how we are, and we have narratives between each other, and we're trying to find out what the narratives are, and we talk about the narratives, and we preach on the narratives, and we're just story within story within story, as well as skin and bone and meat and history and all of those things. And people are limited by what their narratives afford. Many things assault the cartoons. And they themselves are constructed, of course. And sometimes they're overturned. And psychologists will talk about transformation. I did a video a while ago on transformations and addictions, Rhett and Link, and some of the other characters in my little imaginary in which you all inhabit. In Christianity, we often call them conversions. We become different people. And when a woman who was a former lover comes up to Augustine, and Augustine doesn't seem to see her, and Augustine, it is I. And he turns and says, oh, but it's not I. What? How postmodern of you, St. Augustine. I'm not the same man I was when we were lovers. That's why it's not going to happen again. Because something has happened to me. I'm different than I was. You see the world through a new cartoon. Just recently, I like listening to Glenn Lowry's a person that fascinates me in his story. He's writing a memoir. I'm definitely going to get it when it comes out. He had a very interesting interview with Carol Swain. Very interesting story. And, in terms of the political stuff, this would be interesting because Carol Swain, comes up in a rough household and didn't, get much of an education, but one way or another finds herself, in academia, and, she starts to excel and starts to climb the ladder and is lauded with praise and credentials and everything that an academic could want. And she goes to a little storefront church and becomes a Christian, and her whole life changes. And then it gets complicated from there. And it's interesting that Glenn Lowry's talking to her because, of course, Glenn had the experience where he was, he also grew, and then he also had a train wreck in his life, and then also had the experience of going to a church and becoming a Christian and becoming a Christian believer, but then deconstructing from that because of a woman who died. And you can listen to his story. He did a conversation with Robert Wright on meaningoflife.tv as opposed to bloggingheads.tv. And so these conversions shape our worldviews tremendously, and they shape our morals, and they shape our lives. And of course, this is not a hard thing to understand. Now, so our naive view, and I don't mean naive pejoratively, we're bumbling along and we're using our cartoons and our low resolutions, and we encounter something that stimulates a remarkable response. The first time you drive into Yosemite Valley, people from all over the world, Germans, Japanese, Chinese, people from all over the world pile off the bus, and their eyes get big, and there's Bridal Veil Falls. There's Half Dome at the end of the valley. There's El Capitan over to the left. Is Yosemite Valley made up of anything different from the rest of the Sierra? It's just a different pattern. It's all granite and Douglas fir and spruce and grass, and it's just different, right? Why do we experience it as sacred? When the United States, why for so many was the Shaughnessy Dam and Hetch Hetchy such a violation of the sacred? Killed poor old John Muir, some people think. What's going on? It's just rock and wood and earth and water, right? The pattern is disrupted and it gets our attention. Now, Charles Wesley writes this: "Long my imprisoned spirit lay, fast bound in sin and nature's night. Thine eye diffused a quickening ray. I woke, the dungeon flamed with light. My chains fell off, my heart was free. I woes went forth and followed thee." Is he writing about some night he spent in a dungeon? What's he doing? Something had happened in his life. All the narrative, poetic, rhetorical elements of what we call revelation. When we ask, does he mean that literally? What are we asking? How do these words impact you according to your cartoon narrative and your experiential history? Now, some of you might say, oh, so manipulative. Others of you are like, oh, that verse hits me every time. What's happening here? I love going to the Getty in Southern California, and I won't reveal what the painting is about. Some of you will recognize it right away. Now, just watching it right now in the midst of our race conversation, oh, look, a brown-skinned man is running away with a white woman using violence and force. Is that what the picture is about? What's happening? Now look at what's happening with these young women looking at the picture. Young women of different skin tones, different nationalities, different cultures. How many layers can you identify between the observers? All their cartoon layers and the layers of the famous painting. Why did I take this picture? I was going through the Getty, and I often take pictures of things because I think I'll use them, and I almost never do for illustrations, because when I'm there and I see when I'm in the same rooms with the paintings, it's like, oh, there's another one. Oh, look at that. And then sit and I watch and I look, and what does it mean? I don't know, but I can't stop looking, and I wonder, and what strange power these paintings have. Now, we can exhaust a short lifespan just on the questions that this one picture. And so I step back from the picture and I see them watching the picture, and oh, something's happening. I don't quite know what. My relevance realization things were going off. Now, I've had the opportunity of taking small children through the Getty because my wife and I wanted to see it, and we have childcare responsibilities, so we made our trip brief, and we exposed them to a little bit of art. But I'll tell you, a 6 or a 7-year-old doesn't have a very long attention span at the Getty. They're just as interested in other things besides these funny pictures on the wall that their parents seem so enamored with. So there's a transjective experience going on there, to use a fancy Vervaeke term. That somehow, now when I take my children in their 20s to the Getty, it's a totally different thing. But now in my 50s I go to the Getty and it's a totally different thing. These students are growing in appreciation. There's some reciprocal broadening that is happening with the picture. An artist or an expert, Jonathan Peugeot, take him and look him at this painting, he'd probably say, "Oh, I recognize that myth." Well, what myth? Well, what is the woman? Well, she's a god. And what is the dark-skinned man? Well, he's a god. Well, he's Pluto. Pluto, Hades, Greek, Roman. Why is he dark-skinned? Why is he dark-skinned? She's the one that's always out in the sun. She should be dark-skinned. No, she's white as they come, the European Renaissance painter imagines her. And he's dark. Well, he's of the underworld, so his skin is dark. And I'm not an expert in art. You could sit down with Jonathan Peugeot, and Jonathan Peugeot could talk you through this and look at some of the other elements of the painting and describe how this is put together, and on and on and on and on. And what is John doing? Well, John is sort of being a preacher, because taking something that is sort of revelatory, but we're not quite sure how, and translating it to us. And that's a funny thing in and of itself, because suddenly now I see more of it. What's happening? There's some the talking and the translation is becoming some reciprocal broadening in me, and something's happening, and this picture can change your life. Now the Bible talks about these things. You shouldn't be surprised. Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Oh gosh. Please deliver me from these horrible, distracting... I don't want to put on an ad browser. I guess I can open it up in something else. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out in all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In the heavens God has pitched a tent for the sun. It is like the bridegroom coming out of his chamber. It is like the champion rejoicing to hit the course. Like the bridegroom coming out of his chamber. Boy, oh boy, what a great night. Wonder what happened in that chamber with the bridegroom. The champion rejoicing as he runs his course. Eric Liddell, God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. Nothing is deprived of its warmth. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. Notice how the psalmist is playing between these things. I'm doing a little Jonathan Peugeot art interpretation for you there, but that is, of course, what the preacher does. General revelation. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they pour forth wisdom. Well, what's with us? What's with these things? Paul in Romans 1 says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. Well, Carl, there's a nice natural law verse. Who suppress the truth with their wickedness. What? They suppress the truth? Well, how do they suppress the truth? What about those narratives? What about the collision between our desires and, well, we say, people only see what they want to see. No, we suppress the truth with our wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Now, clear in Rafe's tweet is that, well, maybe not revelation, but some of the stuff that's revealed to me in it. Oh, okay, fair enough. And that's sort of the realm of preachers, isn't it? And that's actually what the church is and does, is sift through these things. And so, well, often when I fly out east, I fly over Yosemite. And I don't think this is over Yosemite right here. This is over some random mountains. When I look out of the plane, it's like, oh, wow, cool. It's not like looking at Yosemite Valley, because looking at Yosemite Valley from above is not like looking at Yosemite Valley from the valley floor. And so there's a lot going on here. And again, right away, even though you might say, well, it's what this revelation is supposed to be saying that I can't agree with. Okay. But the supposed to be saying isn't really that different from the seeing it either. And so what we have in the history of the church is just a little bit of conversation about what it's supposed to be saying. Part of what happens is there's sort of a mapping of grace and revelation. With grace, you have common grace, which is sort of the goodness of God sprinkled throughout. And saving grace. And of course, saving is plenty fudgy. What do you mean by save? Save from what, how, when, who, what, with? Well, but the application of that grace in a place, in a moment, to an end, for a reason, by an agent. Revelation, there's general revelation. It's just out there, available to the public, but then special revelation. And it may be that, well, special revelation is, well, it's kind of public, but it's also right there. And it's also just for you. Because, of course, revelation is very much that way. It's transjective. It's watching that Jordan Peterson video, and it's been the same every time, but I go back to it, it's like, oh, I see something else. Well, did the video change? Or did I change? And why that video and not every video? Is the difference something like relevance realization? Now, I remember talking to one of the pastors in the Dominican Republic who told me the first time his mother saw a train, she ran because she said, "It's the devil." Well, if you look at a steam locomotive with the noise and the size and the, it looks like the devil. Special revelation is something extraordinary. Now, what I just said before, I don't mean to say that it's necessarily always private. Often it is. If I'm reading the Bible and, well, here's the revelation. It's actually built from different, is it actually built from different things? Well, my eyes see certain kinds of things. They see wavelength and so on and so forth. The perceptions of my mind are a good bit more mysterious. How does it connect with you and the pattern that you are? Because you yourself are a pattern. Watch Jonathan Peugeot's conversation with Andrea and Mercury. Why do millions of millions of people in the world travel to visit a place like Yosemite? Is that special revelation? Well, not exactly in terms of what Christians talk about, but it's not disconnected either. So we have witnesses and representation. N.T. Wright notes that, well, the New Testament, these passages about the resurrection are terribly unembroidered. What does he mean by that? It means like many passages they're filled with little literary clues that the narrator is preaching and making some theological points, and he's using symbolism and a whole bunch of other things. But the resurrection, they just didn't know what to do with it. That was a really special revelation. And modernists are right in saying, well, I'm going to judge revelation by its impact. Okay, we can do that. But not just that. People I mean, John Calvin basically said, well, how do I know that Scripture is different from other books? I can feel it in my heart. It's very Protestant of him, but it's also very pre-modern of him. But it also works today. In the resurrection of Jesus, people don't recognize him. Well, that's strange. Of course, they don't believe the story right off the bat, even though he told them. But you have when Jesus says, I'm going to be turned over to the hands of Gentiles, and in 3 days I will rise from the dead. Well, how do you hear that? He said so many strange things. They never know what he's talking about anyway. And they're afraid to ask him questions. They're always afraid to ask him questions because they look like idiots. Sometimes he loses his temper at them. Even skeptical New Testament scholars, however, say the disciples saw something that changed them. You're pretty hard-pressed. Now, many are materialists, and they'll say, I can't believe he rose from the dead. Okay. But what did they see? And they didn't just see it as individuals. They saw it together. And what language do I have to talk about what I've never touched? And in fact, I was doing Discord question and answer this morning. I was asked a question about something, and I'd used some language that at other points I might have critiqued, but I was answering the question and thinking about the language I was using. I was thinking about the fact that this is about the only language that I can use to communicate this thing. And something is out there that I bump into. Is Yosemite Valley supernatural? Well, you might say no, because we have science of glaciation, erosion, and volcanism. Is it sacred? Is it publicly sacred? The American government seems to think so. Why are you curious about the process that made Yosemite Valley? Does it make the valley less or more glorious to know the process? A lot of science people say more. I agree. Does it make it less common or more amazing? Glaciation happened all up and down the Sierra. Why is this valley this way? Oh, because volcanism, and you get up to Glacier Point, and they have a nice representation of it, and they have a nice thing in the visitor center, and they'll talk all about it. Does it mean that the valley was an accident? What is an accident? Not the product of purpose or systemic agency. Well, the systemic agency, the systems of glaciation and volcanism, but nobody, persons? Nobody planned it or designed it. How do you know? Are your persons limited to human beings? Because if you say that, agency emerges, there's all kinds of systems. We talk like they have agency. Well, what if there's an agency that comes before the emergent agencies we see? We can't answer that question. I haven't proved to you that it is there, but it's not an unreasonable thing to believe. What kind of revelation is happening here? General revelation, certainly. There's the lighting in the room. There's the skill of the artist. There's all of that. Is there any special revelation happening here? Well, the question gets a lot harder. Could you tell if there was? Is my photograph of these young girls looking at this artist capturing or giving evidence for some degree of special revelation? Well, maybe not. In terms of Christian theology, I didn't say that. I'm talking about the category, not the instances. How might you go investigating as to whether or not there's special revelation going on? I don't think you're going to get there from the camera. You might stop and pause and speak with the young women and say, what do you think about this picture? Why did you pause? Why did you huddle up? Why did you whisper to each other? Why did you take a picture of it? What's happening? What's going through your head? You can't see it from the outside. You have to see it from the inside. Might there be a special revelation that you can capture with pictures? Well, we sort of caught it with the camera. It's very low resolution, but just look at their body language. Look at the girl with the hand over her mouth. Look at the other one pointing with she's got the brochure in her hand. Look at the other woman, leaning over and whispering to, what's going on here? in the conversation between Brett Weinstein and David Fuller, well, people are starting to change on some of these ideas. A lot of materialists for whom their category of religion was different, now their category of religion is a little bit different. And religion plays in their world a little differently than it was before. The Distributist had quite an interesting little video on This Is Not Water, where he talked about, of course, he's a kind of a reactionary, conservative Roman Catholic who converted into that. And he tells, I like it when people tell their stories on YouTube. I'm nosy that way. Often the stories we tell about the transformations of our narrative are some of the most helpful because some of the patterns match. And when we're really dealing with the narratives out of which we speak and the narratives out of which we work, we realize that we're dealing with ourselves at a very low level. And so on one hand, if you've got someone who was a leader in a church who was going through this performance and was getting a lot of accolades and money and jobs and doing all that, getting to a point that realizes, well, I don't believe this stuff anymore. And so I'm going to go, it's always on Instagram, isn't it? Isn't that funny? I'm going to go out on Instagram and I'm going to tell the world that I don't believe anymore. And then everyone's like, oh no! Well, fortunately, Justin Brierley and Sean McDonald have their head about them. And let's not panic. Let's talk about it. What's going on? What's going on in there? Did you think that you didn't have filters through which you apprehended this faith and imbibed the faith of your lovely parents? His parents were wonderful people. We see the world through our cartoon narratives. I've got some repetitions of slides here. Got a lot of repetitions of slides here. What's going on? Here we go. There's the slide I was waiting for. What kind of revelation is this? This is the adduction. This is the adduction of Proserpine. Proserpina. The best way to say it. J. Paul Getty Museum. And some of you knew this right away, but others of you didn't. 1570, Italian Renaissance. Well, why is he painting a picture of classical Roman mythology? Well, she's the spring. And why does the spring go away? Well, the spring goes away because the god of the underworld kills and brings her down. Because why? Well, he fell in love with her. And Pluto, the god of the underworld, seizes Proserpina, daughter of the Roman goddess of agriculture and fertility, Ceres, and prepares to return with her to her kingdom on a chariot drawn by 4 black horses. According to Ovid's Metamorphoses, Proserpina was forced to live in the underworld 4 months every year. Her departure from Earth marked the advent of winter, and a return brought about spring and summer. Muscular, marble-like figures illustrate the influence of Michelangelo on the younger Florentine artist, while the complex, twisted poses and bright, saturated colors reflect that of his adopted father and mother. Bronzino, painted on the painted on the large wood panel. This work was conceived as part of a series of 3 monumental mythological scenes painted between 1570 and 1572 as decoration for this house near Florence. Accompanying scenes depicting Aeneas and Anchises and Narcissus are today located at the residence of the Turkish ambassador in Washington, D.C. So what is this picture representing? It's representing the coming of fall and the death of winter and the coming of spring. Does it represent that in a way? Yeah, it does. Now, the subtraction story might say, this is a made-up story to explain the changing of the seasons. Well, you can look at it that way. But isn't there a lot built into this representation that little subtraction story doesn't get at? Isn't there a lot built into this story that just talking about the earth and the sun and plants and all of this other story that talks about the changing of the seasons, doesn't this look at it through a different lens? Through, what is it when the winter snows start coming and the plants die and the flowers go on. And what does that feel like? What is it like? What kind of revelation is this? Paul's pushing dominion again. The most stubborn historical evidence of the story of Jesus Christ. What was revealed by that man on the cross? What movie were the mockers seeing? What movie were the followers seeing? What was being revealed in that moment? The instance of that moment has been revelatorily, enormously productive for 2,000 years. Empty crosses in Protestant churches, crucifixes in Roman Catholic churches, representation after representation all over the place here, one donning a book cover. What's revelation? Now, of course, there are laws of nature, and I've made this point in numerous videos, and people persist in, I think, resisting the point of the illustration. Many of us still can't see the irony in our use of the word laws. What revelation or realization are we lacking? Agents give laws. Systemic agency of physics, you say? Patterns we have detected and projected into eternity. The use of this word laws has its own history. So we have supernatural stories, and Alistair McGrath noted to Brett Weinstein, you better be a little careful with that word. It's not as old as you think. And we hear these stories frequently. And I just recently told what's supernatural today. Miracles don't happen. Okay, what you mean laws of time and space as you've grown to understand them don't happen. Really? I just recently told one in a sermon. My life is pretty normal. Things follow pretty much according to general revelation, but every now and then someone tells me a secret. And they don't say it in public because in this context they lose status, or people think they're crazy, or they're unreliable, or, something like that. And pastors are keepers of stories, and my father put a lot of his stories into his book. And some of the best stories he didn't put in his book because he can't talk about them because people are still alive. And now I'm an internet pastor, so people send me an email or sign up on my thing for a slot. And I haven't had slots for the end of June because I'm working on this other project that I need to work on, and I need the time for that. So sorry about that, but there'll be more slots in the future. I do continue to do the question and answer on Discord, so if you want to get a question into me, that's a pretty good place, and I'm still tinkering that with the Discord. But, here's the funny thing about miracles, is that people think, well, if I saw one, it would change me. No, because those miracles are just data, and those narratives, those downloaded low-resolution images on your hard drive are still pretty powerful. And, as sometimes people see when it rearranges them, but the story of Jesus and the disciples are full of, they have these outlandish experiences that Jesus stills the storm, and, what is he? But can they still believe him? All those narratives are deep and pervasive and stubborn, probably for the rest of our biological lives. And then one person, and I know on the Discord server, he shared the stories with a few others of you, but he chose not to make it public, but he did give me permission to share this. I just share it as an illustration. I've heard many other stories like it. 15-year-old from a broken home, friend of the family, lives in another state, has a vision. It's the only vision this guy ever saw. Not the kind to see visions. Didn't go to a Pentecostal church. Went to an Episcopalian church. Pay attention when an Episcopalian has a vision. And he felt the need to travel to see this young man and tell him about this vision because God told him to go tell him. And so this 15-year-old has this guy come, friend of the family, guy come and says, God told me to send something to you. At that point in his life, he was a Christian. There'll be a girl that you love, and she'll die young and be with God. There's the message. What do you do with that? Why? What kind of a good God would send a message like that? Boy, that'll mess up a kid's life. And so the kid and his mother imagine, well, it must be my sister. So, Protect the sister. Keep it from happening. So they protect the sister. But he has a girlfriend. And they get engaged. And he comes back on a college visit. And he's driving in the car and she's driving. And there's an accident. And she's killed and he's spared. And he loses his faith. Well, I don't believe that man had a vision. Well, the man obviously thought he had a vision. Thought he had a vision enough to drive across state lines to deliver it to a 15-year-old kid, and he probably felt like an idiot doing it. Well, I don't believe these things happen. The person who told me this has no reason to lie about it. It was just interwoven in his story. He doesn't know what to do with it. He's a believer again, but that took a long time. Why would God let things like this happen? I can't answer for God. Stories that divide time. The people are credible. There's no motivation to lie, no history of lying, and in fact, they lose status by telling stories that make them sound a little crazy. But they're not that uncommon. And they don't have the impact in people that you'd expect. In fact, like in this story, okay, let's be a little careful with the sister. Always wear your seatbelt. Often they doubt what they saw and they have second thoughts. Doesn't necessarily change them any of the way that we imagine it would change them in our modernist framework. It doesn't give them unwavering faith at all, usually. And it might not change their religious assumptions at all. I've had non-believers tell me the most outrageous stories, and I'd say, does this change the way you look at the world? No, weird things happen. Oh, okay. That's how you file it. But oh, that Bible. God didn't write that book. How Christians language biblical inspiration and debate it rages on, and it isn't going to stop. Mormons and Muslims are a lot clearer. Dictation theory. My tradition talks about organic inspiration. It's not dictation or mechanical. God moves through the world, and there's that Bible. And look at Bishop Barron's comments on Cuomo. God isn't inside the system. And when Sam Harris says, a perfect being would sit down and write. Well, how is God writing history right now? Is he sending it in a book for you to read, and these are the steps you follow out? It's God's agency, for primary and secondary agency. My conversation with Brett Sockold. Governor Cuomo says, God didn't flatten the curve, we did. And Bishop Barron says, you have no idea what you're saying when you use that word, do you? You just showed the world you don't. You just showed Cuomo, I would imagine, grew up Catholic. Here the bishop is saying, you didn't really catch it in catechism class, did you? The Bible is the Bible less a formation of history than Yosemite Valley? See Jordan Peterson's intro to the Bible in Biblical Series 1. It's a mysterious book. We can't figure it out. Jordan Peterson says, these people are awfully dismissive. It's strange. But what do Christians mean with their language? Say, well, I believe the Bible is the Word of God. Good. Read the book of James. Even the devils believe in God and tremble. I believe the Bible is the Word of God. Good. Name those propositional things about your Bible all you want. And they use that language as we honor it. We try to obey it. We try to apply it. We try to follow it. We hold it as special. It's holy. It's at the top of our hierarchy. But really? Is that how you really live? No, we do it badly. Well, what if you did? Does that mean you would hold slaves? Does that mean you could, if you're suspicious about your wife, you take the sweepings of the church floor, put it in water, and make her drink it and see what happens? No. We've been talking about this the whole time. Well, what does it mean that it's revelation? That's what we keep talking about. We keep trying to figure it out. But What if the revelation isn't just a whole bunch of content that drops on us, but in fact properly locating us in the kinds of conversations that will yield the kinds of lives that he wants us to live? What if him, and I say dropping, like Yosemite Valley being dropped into the landscape of Northern California, boom, it didn't come back, that came up this way. What if having this book form in the world like Yosemite Valley was formed changed world history in a particular way, according to the kind of authoring that the author of Yosemite Valley uses to create something sacred and something glorious? Watch what they do. Watch what we do. And now what we say. Yeah, you're a bunch of hypocrites. Oh, you got that right. Skeptics and critics have long charged that Christians are selective, inconsistent, and have a canon within the canon. Guilty as charged all the time. Nobody knows it better than other Christians. Christians struggle to talk about what we experience and what we do. But the similarities aren't that hard to see. Really, they're not. There's actually very little insider information in the Bible. What do I mean by that? It's that insider information that's exactly what modernists imagine the Bible should be chock full of, and that insider information should be, smiting us down like heroin and cocaine addicts, or giving us tools like hydrogen bombs in order to wield for power in the world. No! Look at Jesus. Peter Enns, I thought his first book was his best book. He compares, got kicked out of Westminster Seminary for it. He compares, we say that Jesus is the Word of God, and we say the Bible is the Word of God. Why do we use that language for both things? And he compares and contrasts inspiration and incarnation. Yeah, that's a good thing. Jesus comments on the little apocalypse. A lot of people have noted, was it really that hard to imagine that in a fairly short time, the culture war of the first century and the first century Second Temple Judaism was putting them on a collision course with the Roman Empire? That's not hard to see. How about marriage in the age to come? There's an interesting passage. But what on earth will the age to come look like? I don't know. All of what we are told about it are these little symbolic indicators that sort of excite the imagination, but we're giving plenty of moral things. Don't store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust consume. Store up treasures in heaven. What does that mean? Discuss. The Bible has shaped history, clearly different from most mythology, as C.S. Lewis points out, and Ezekiel Kaufman. Debates about the way the Bible conceptualizes history rage. Augustine, Calvin, they're not going to end. We can't put this stuff together. Well, then how does revelation work? Well, look at the girls in front of the painting. How does revelation work? Look at the tourists in Yosemite Valley. How does revelation work? The more we see how our conceptualization and language is cultural for us, the more complex it gets. Now, and representation is always interpretation. Here's the Battle of White Mountain. Well, you got angels holding this thing above that. Did you see that when you were at the battle? Well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Here, you can go to Yosemite Valley and not even look at El Capitan and just take a little microphone, put it by this little baby red squirrel, and see some glory. Maybe there's something to this seeing and representation. Right now in Northern California, we're having a big fight about, or there might be a fight about Negro Bar, which is in the gold mining areas here. Well, why is it Negro Bar? Well, that was probably a named improvement over its previous name. Won't take too much imagination to figure out what that might have been. Well, because both freed and enslaved black men came across the United States during the gold rush to try and participate in the gold rush, and this was a place where they did it. So what do you call it? And we have Squaw Valley. I thought, wonder what the etymology of squaw is. Oh, it's an Algonquin word for woman, Well, it was used pejoratively, and racists used the word. I don't know how much of the English language we're going to have left. Brett Weinstein said, I've seen movements among Christians about people understanding the formative way in which their mythology occurs. I'm glad he's seen the movement. And again, no disrespect here, but it's not new. It's not new at all. Now, maybe fault Christians for not being good communicators of what they believe, but it's not new at all. And of course, now, as usual, I'll probably get into more trouble with some of the Christians, but I worry less about that because you're already Christians. But, the reason why we esteem this book is because of the revelation of the one who quoted so much out of the First Testament of this book, and the reliability of the other witnesses that wrote in the Second Testament of this book. But yeah, it comes out of history just like Yosemite, only with words, and out of the revelation of a guy who says, touch these scars, put your hand in my side. You got something to eat? Let me have some of that fish. I want you to see that I am not a ghost, that you can touch me, that you can smell my breath, that you can see me eat a fish. I want that to sink in. I don't believe that. Okay. All right. Religious people have long understood the glacial formation of their revelation. It isn't why we attribute it. Isn't this why we attribute it to God, just like we do Yosemite Valley? Now, literal, well, Pajot and Brett should have that conversation about that word, and higher, and all of these other words, because I think the fudgy part is in literal. Because literal is, well, what you mean by that usually is I'm going to have a very easy association where I can relate these two things causally. Causation. What caused Yosemite Valley? Aristotle had some clues with his 4 causes. There's got to be at least that many. We have so much to talk about on this front. Christians tend to assume God and extrapolate to the particular, from the manifest to the scientific. Sciencers like eliminating variables to get down to tiny common relationships and extrapolate to the manifest image. Okay. And I think I understand better some of Vervaeke's talks about direction, the emanation versus emergence. So that takes me a little while to get up to speed on those fancy Vervaeke terms. What prompts a change in your story making? And what is the shape of that story making? And the fact that you look at the contents of this revelation and say, I've got problems with that. Well, maybe you're bumping into something transcendent. And you're walking through the Getty and you see this picture of a brown-skinned man carrying away a white-skinned woman. And you say, racism! I'm not sure that's what the Italian Renaissance was trying to illustrate. Maybe we'll have to destroy the painting because it's, a representation of, you see, the world is big, it's complex. What prompts a change in your story making? What changes your narrative? The transjective in the Bible is all over the place. Jesus' baptism. Some heard words, some said it thundered. Paul on the road to Damascus. Paul sees this. Others aren't so sure. What's happening? Was that transjective? Was Paul able to see something that the others couldn't? Was that God somehow doing a special trick? Those words are, in fact, of course, a representation. Did it have to do with the narrative inside of Paul? Let those who have ears to hear. Jesus says that again and again and again and again. Sounds terribly transjective. Well, the movement of the Holy Spirit enables me to, this is John Calvin, understand what's in his word. Well, how does the Holy Spirit move? With glaciers and volcanism and water and time in Yosemite. With time and people and books and images in Paul Vanderklay. The God of redemption is the God of creation. The language of the Holy Spirit is often transjective. Where exactly is the Spirit? God is above, Jesus is alongside, the Spirit is inside, between, coming down. Spirit is always going this way. Look at the miraculous. Again, if you wonder about miracles, read Craig Keener's Miracles. It's a long book. He has 2 volumes of it. But what does he do? He just offers evidence. Now, that might not mean you will believe any of it. But to say, these things don't happen. Okay. I don't know what you do with the evidence. It's all people who will be fooled. Here's the thing. We're all walking around with these cartoons. It's the things that we can't move that's the fact of transcendence, as Peterson says. Much of the observation of revelation in this video applies to miracles as well. They're, of course, perceived. The Bible is, of course, the world's best-selling book. Its track record is unique. All of this is perceived, eyes to see, ears to hear. The impact of technology, I think, is the key takeaway here of our current imaginary. And the more we learn about human perception and cognitive science, to me at least, the more this common sense modernist framework evaporates. We impress ourselves with our new knowledge and our power until we expose to each other that we are gods with clay feet. We don't see so good. We don't represent very well. Somebody asked me about Christian entry requirements and minimum equipment necessary on today's Discord question and answer. My answers are simple. Call out to Jesus. Ask him. He says he'll listen. What do you mean he? Wouldn't he live 2,000 years ago? Just crazy. Yeah, but again, human beings are very strange things. When someday my children put me in the ground, well, I'm going to continue living in their hearts, as even the secular people say. Christian theology says, I'll go to be with the Lord, and at least within this time frame, await the resurrection. We have Samuel coming up to address Saul. I mean, it's just full of strangeness. It's very strange. Well, you want to be a Christian? Start playing around with it.